Morning, jazz lovers. Here we are again, back at the Australian Jazz Museum. And today I am with not one, but two techno-boffins. I'm here to interview Ken Simpson-Bull, and Steve Maz is looking after our audio and video for us today. So I'm in great company. Ken, as you know, the Jazz Museum is just about to turn 30. You're 90. I know you've worked here for a long time, and Ian Rutherford and Steve Maz have both asked me to interview you because you're such an important part of the history and current day events of this museum. So it's great to be here with you today. Maybe you'd like to tell me a little bit about how you got started here. How did you come to be working at the Jazz Museum?
Well, it's been 17 years now since I've been here. It all happened, I was listening to the radio on a Saturday morning to Jazz on a Saturday, and Don Anderson was being interviewed. Now, Don and Margaret Anderson were the archivists for the Australian Jazz Convention, and he happened to mention on the radio that they were looking for volunteers at the Victorian Jazz Archive, as it was known then, and it was at Turner. Well, I lived in Glen Waverley, so it's only a short drive. So I thought, this is interesting. I'm looking for something now that I'm retired to keep me busy. So I wandered over. I had a few jazz-related artefacts that I brought over and contributed to the museum. I was thankfully received. And I said I'd be interested in working on sound. And they said, no, we've got a fellow looking after the sound. His name's John Smythe. And that's the same John Smythe that I would have been listening to on the radio. 3CR. John Smythe's still an announcer among the three main Jazz on a Saturday announcers on 3CR. Anyway, so I nearly walked out the door and Noel Blatchford said, just a minute, don't leave. We've got some other work you can do. So he enlisted me as a volunteer. And when I started, which this would have been, as I say, 17 years ago now, I was given I told him I was interested in 78 RPM records because I had a pretty big collection, mainly jazz. I had, in fact, my collection numbers over 3,000 78s, largely jazz, but also dance bands, particularly hot dance bands.
More than pretty big.
Yeah, it's one of them pretty big. And that dates from the fact that I just enjoyed early jazz, 1920s and 30s, Red Nichols, Big Beiderbecke, that sort of thing. And anyway, that was my interest in jazz, plus my growing up in the jazz era. Of course, the jazz era is generally known as the 20th, but there was a revival of jazz in the 1940s and 50s, in which that was the era in which I grew up. So when I used to go dancing, that'd be jazz bands and so on. So I got to love particularly Dixieland jazz. So I was interested in jazz. Is a jazz museum, but I was interested in audio, and I would like to work in audio. Anyway, Mel Blatchford said, start as a volunteer. Here's all these 78s that you love. You should sort them out, tell us which are important, catalogue them, etc., etc. So that's how I began. In the meantime, they made use of my technical facilities for checking out a bit of audio gear that we'd had donated to the Jazz Museum, and that I went along that way for a few months. Then John Smythe left. And they said, all right, you can move into the sound room with Bill Brown, who was not a technical person, but he was a very knowledgeable person as far as jazz was concerned. He could name any jazz tune that you could play. It was amazing. And he could even identify jazz bands. So Bill and I worked together in the sound room Bill passed away a couple of years back, but until then we worked together in the sound room.
It might be worth just mentioning here that we are sitting in the sound room today.
We are indeed.
We are indeed. Yeah, we thought this would be Steve's idea. Thought this would be a good idea to have the interview. Yeah, in here.
Anyway, I'll let you go on with your questioning.
Well, I was just wondering where you gained all this technical knowledge that you brought here. Where did you gain all that knowledge?
Well, I went to school. Well, the secondary schooling was at Brighton Tech, and when I left school, I wasn't quite sure what direction to take. It a choice of journalism. English was my favourite subject at school, or technology, particularly. I wanted to work in a radio station in broadcast engineering, recording and all that type of thing. So there was an opportunity. The PMG, first of all, the ABC, their technical services were run by the PMG, and the PMG had a 5-year technician in training course, which part of the train or a section of the trainees would be allocated to the ABC studios. But I was told in an interview that only the top trainees with their studies would get the opportunity to go to the ABC. Now I thought, well, I think I've got a brain because I happen to have been ducks at Brighton Tech. So I thought, I can do this. So I did 5 years study in order to get to the ABC. And that involved a lot of telephone training as well. So I finished up at the ABC in 1955 and began in a recording section. In those days, tape recording was still new. And I was involved in not only recording, but maintenance of recorders. And also in the studios, they did not have tape recorders. So if there was a program or a segment on tape, it would be played from a separate department, which was called the recorder. That was a series of rooms with mainly console-type tape recorders in them. And I worked there for quite a while. From there, I progressed to, they asked me to do training of new staff that were coming in, training people in panel operating and recording and that type of thing. So I was involved in some training duties. Then I got a job in the, what was it called? Design section. We were designing new equipment, new installations. And my biggest job there was designing a complete complex for Radio Australia. Radio Australia was located in various parts of the city, some broadcast house, some in Leichhardt Street at the other end of the city, and they were consolidating in a building in Lonsdale Street. And I designed the whole complex with the help of some engineers. So that was my biggest project. And then I studied for a television operator certificate at RMIT, which enabled me to move into television. And that occurred at the same time as the ABC took over its own technical services from the PMG. I was still in the PMG, so I transferred to the ABC. They set up their own training departments for training their own technical people, and I got involved in that, and I became, what did they call me? A training officer. Technical instructor, that was a technical instructor was the designation they used. So after that, well, the rest of my career was in mainly technical training in the ABC, and I finished up as head of training. So that covers my career path pretty well, I would have thought.
Well, you really you had a goal. You put it in the 5 years. Obviously, you did well enough to be one of the people getting picked. Yeah.
I studied hard. I definitely wanted that job.
Well,
I didn't want to work at telephones.
No, but you were pretty sure you had the goods to be one of those people to be picked. Yeah, ducks at school. No mean feat.
Probably a bit of luck, but I did study hard.
Doubt that. How many years did you spend at the ABC?
I think there's 38 rings a bell. I'll have to add it. Well, I started 38 years or so.
And when did you retire from there?
It would have, I've been retired about 35 years on. So, what are the maths? About 1990, something like that. Around 1990 I would have retired.
And what have you been doing since then?
Working at the Jazz Museum. On this collection of 3,078 I mentioned, I've been transferring them to CD. That's been a bit of a hobby of mine.
Can you explain that process to the uninitiated?
The interesting thing is that that's what I did best here at the Jazz Museum was digitising early recordings. Perhaps we might talk about what happens at the Jazz Museum and how my hobby worked in with what I do here. Certain recordings like 78s, vinyl, 45s, LPs are all permanent recordings. If they're well stored, they'll last pretty well forever. But tapes, cassettes, and before tapes, recordings were done on acetate recordings. In fact, I've just happened to have an acetate recording here. It's like a normal gramophone record, but what happens with these acetate recordings, they're an aluminium base coated with a cellulose nitrate material. Why acetate? Because originally it was cellulose acetate. They found cellulose nitrate was a better coating for the cutting of the record, and they shortened it to acetate. So that's an acetate recording with the coating peeling off. And this is what happens with acetate recording, which means any recording that was done before tape, which in Australia we didn't see tape until around 1950. So anything recorded before 1950 is pretty much done on acetate recordings. So all our early jazz would have came in on these types of recordings.
Can I ask you a question out of my own ignorance? What is the difference in this and a normal record?
Right, this is a direct cut disc, and it's cut on equipment which we might be able to. It's in section behind me here, and we might be able to have a glimpse of that later.
Yeah.
But it's on display here. It's a recording lathe which is placed on a turntable. A blank acetate disc. It's a blank disc.
Oh.
Just a blank acetate disc, and placed on the turntable. There's a cutting head that cuts from the outside to the inside, or alternatively, can actually cut from the inside to the outside. And you finish up.
Have a look.
With thank you. You finish up with a record, a gramophone record.
So that's all the thing going around. That's all those little grooves we see. Was nose to see on, not on this, but on a record.
The grooves are actually cut by the cutting style.
Gee, it feels strange, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, the thing was, if that was a recording that's used before 1950, now you say, what's the difference between that and a normal gramophone record? There's a 78. It's an ampersand recording, which I might mention later. They were made in Australia by a fellow called Bill Miller, who decided that the large record companies, the international record companies, were not releasing Australian jazz, and he set up his own company, which he called Ampersand. And he produced about 46 10-inch 78s and about 8 or so 12-inch 78s, double-sided ones. So quite a bit of recording. And just as a matter of interest, he recorded a lot more material than was ever released on these discs. Now, you ask what the difference was. We'll cover that before I go on any further. The difference is that in a commercial recording, after the acetate recording is cut, there's there's an electroplating process which produces a stamper, actually a billet stamper. After electroplating the disc, a stamper is produced, which is a negative of that. It has grooves cut into the disc. This has the recording stands out. That is then stamped onto a material, shellac, or that is a vinyl recording, shellac or vinyl, which then presses the disc. Now what you finish up with is a pressed disc.
What's this little bit of white coming through here?
I think that's just somebody's spilled a bit of paint up.
Oh, have they? Yeah. Oh, I thought it was the base, but
you're not allowed to ask that. But
I think you're right. A red herring.
So, that was a type of recording. Now, I was talking about the permanence of recordings. So, the pressed disc, one's pressed out of shellac or vinyl, is permanent, won't wear out. When I say wear out, it won't deteriorate in time if it's kept stored correctly. But the acetate, if we get these acetates being made by amateurs at home or in some recording, some venue where they've recorded a jazz band, which we get a lot of, we have to digitise these so as to make a permanent recording. And I guess over the 17 years I've saved thousands of hours of jazz from deterioration by digitising these acetates.
Can I ask you to explain to us what the process of digitising means and entails?
Right. Well, in practical terms, it just means playing the record for the gramophone pickup, feeding it into a computer. The computer program converts the analog signal into a digital signal, and that's stored. The method of storage has changed in the 17 years I'm here. Initially, the digital signal was recorded or burnt onto a CD, which we called a PCD, preservation compact disc. Then they decided to store the digital file. They were recorded as a WAV file, which is a lossless digital file. That's now stored on a hard disk. We have a very, very multi-terabyte hard disk in the system, our server, and that's backed up in the cloud, and the cloud is just some giant computer in one of those data centres that we're building many of in Australia at the moment. People say we don't want data centres. Well, where are we going to store the backups of our audio files?
You mean to tell me they're not actually up in the clouds?
Well, up in the clouds, that's right. So, so digitisation is just practically you just feed the music into a computer, the program turns it into a digital signal. There are things like, we could go into more technicalities, which is probably not worthwhile, but I mentioned we use WAV files, which means the audio is turned into a digital signal without any losses or changes in quality. We sometimes, and it takes up a lot of computer space on the hard disk. If we want to reduce the space, especially if we've got sound of a poorer quality, or we don't need full professional quality, we use MP3 recording. Although by the same token, high bitrate MP3 recording can sound pretty much exactly the same as the original, but it does save a lot of storage space on the hard drives. So here at the Jazz Museum, primarily WAV files we record, but occasionally MP3 files.
When I started coming here, I was so aware of the cataloguing and the volunteers. I was thinking of them in an administrative role, but the more I learn about the place, I realize there's a lot of highbrow knowledge amongst the volunteers who come here. So much intellect and knowledge is encapsulated here in the place, isn't it? Amazing.
It is, yeah.
It's far more than just people sorting things into piles.
Not sure what it is, but
No, but it is. It's people like yourself and Steve and Ian, and so many people here bringing so many skills to this place.
You're right.
How has it enriched your life working here?
Well, first of all, one of the things that makes it enjoyable working here is my love of jazz. And I've had to think about this the other day. Why do I love music from the 1920s and 30s? And I remember when I was growing up, 9-10 years old, I used to visit my great aunt who had a wind-up gramophone. At home, we didn't have a gramophone of any description. But in the 40s, wireless programs play a lot of jazz. Lot more than you hear on the radio these days. You also hear a lot more classical music on commercial radio that you just don't hear these days either. So radio was quite different in the 40s and early 50s. So I visited my aunt, and she had a collection of records for the grind-up gramophone, and there was some by the Volunteer Firemen, and another group was the Clicquot Club Eskimos. I later in life found out that these were a group led by Harry Reeser, who was the world's greatest jazz banjo player at the time. And he led a Dixieland-style band in the 20s. I used to play these records over and over, and that's where I got this love of early jazz, and it stayed with me all my life. And fortunately, we have jazz bands to this very day playing in the same style. That's the type of jazz I love. And that's why this job has been just so interesting for me.
Well, musicians certainly come in here when the groups come in. They come in here and volunteer their time to entertain the troops.
It's one of the perks of the job, to be able to listen to all these.
Do you come in when the musicians are here playing?
Oh, well, you have a listen, yeah. I usually poke my head in the door and have a bit of a listen, yeah.
Yeah. Have you met any musicians that have, etched in your memory?
Well, I did a few interviews, it'll be in the piece, interviewed people like Wes Brown, who was drummer with Frank Johnson's band, and that brings up my teenage years, or later teenage years, where I used to go to dances. And in those days, they were jazz bands, mainly. I used to go to Collingwood Town Hall where Frank Johnson played, and I knew Wes Brown, the drummer, quite well, actually. And Wes came here and helped us out at the Jazz Museum at one time. So he was one of the interviewers. Keith Hounslow, trumpeter, was another person I interviewed. He was a well-known trumpet player. I interviewed Bob I spoke to Bob. When I say interviews, I like to get some information from Bob Barnard, the information I used in an article I wrote. So you could say I interviewed Bob Barnard on the telephone. Although I met Bob recently, when I say recently, within the last few years at I used to go to the Victorian Jazz Club functions at Clayton. I haven't been in for 2 or 3 years or more, but I used to go fairly regularly to the jazz club functions. In fact, as I say, growing up, I used to go where the jazz bands played. Frank Johnson also played at the Mason Deluxe in Elwood. That was another place. I used to go to Mentone Lifesaving Club where the Len Barnard had a band with his young brother Bob. Bob Barnard was the young upcoming trumpet player, and Len Barnard was the star. Of course, Bob Barnard became probably the more famous of the two. Frank Traynor, I used to go to dances with Frank Traynor. So I did, Grave and Graham Bell. I went to functions where Graham Bell's band played. So I met all those greats from the 1940s and 50s.
What about here, working here? It sounds like a lot of those you made out about socialising and
I've never really kept
dancing.
up to date with modern bands. So, and that brings up another point. When I say I haven't kept up to date with current bands, apart from the ones that I would have seen at the Victorian Jazz Club. And when I use the word modern bands there, it reminded me to make the point that I'm not particularly keen on modern jazz. So rebop or bebop or bop, as we called it back in the 40s, wasn't my style at all. However, strangely, I wrote an article for the Jazz magazine, and that we should talk about the Jazz magazine, how I came to write for it, which featured modern jazz. So I got out a lot of Dizzy Gillespie and the like, and started playing them. And I thought, this isn't bad at all. And I got a bit of a liking for modern jazz very much later in life.
We've been talking about your achievements, Ken, and one achievement that hasn't been mentioned today is that you do have the Order of Australia Medal.
Yes, well, I received that for my contribution to jazz music. And my understanding is because I saved so many hundreds of hours of historic music recorded on acetates from disintegration, from complete oblivion. So my ability to restore this early music, I think, was seen of some importance.
You must have impressed a few people.
Mm.
I'd say so. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's wonderful. There's one other piece of equipment here, if equipment's the right word, that when you had all your records and things out before, there was one thing that I noticed that you didn't get mentioned, and that is this incredible, heavy, I'm going to hold this up for the camera. It's a record. It's probably about 12 inches across by the look of it.
10
inches. And it says Edison Recreation. And it's much thicker than the normal record. Could you tell us something about this? I mean, Thomas Edison's name is, his face appears on this, his signature appears, and is a product of the Edison Laboratories. So could you, before we finish today, this beautiful creation, can you explain to us why it looks so different, feels so different to a normal record?
Well, I think it's fairly well known that Thomas Edison invented the phonograph, which became what we call the gramophone now. In his original recording, which he used a cylinder, the recording stylus, the recording needle on the cylinder, moved up and down. When he converted to flat records, he maintained the same form of modulation in the grooves of the record. That is, the needle that replays, or the stylus that replays the music, vibrates in a vertical manner. And these particular recordings are called hill and dale recordings, the up and down, the hill and dale. Most, in fact, all records, other than the Edisons, and there were a few minor companies back in the 1920s and 10s, but apart from those companies, and I mean, including particularly Edison, all the other companies used lateral modulation. In other words, the music in the groove caused the stylus to move from side to side. Now, you asked about the thickness. Since Edison's records causes the stylus to move up and down, which produces the music out of the loudspeakers, any buckle which a thinner record might produce would cause a rumble.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Bumping up and down. Yeah, the stylus was bumping up and down. He made the records thick so they couldn't buckle. Now, I discovered that we've got about a dozen of these Hill and Dale recordings in the museum, and they're obscure dance bands. This one's by the Broadway Dance Orchestra. However, I happen to know that Jimmy Dorsey plays saxophone on this record.
What about
very young, because this dates from about 1929.
Tommy Dorsey too on the record?
Tommy Dorsey appeared on some of these obscure tracks. Whether he's on this one, I can't remember. But the Dorsey brothers did play on these. Now, most of these recordings were done. He finished in 1930. He decided that people just didn't have the equipment to play his vertically modulated records, so he gave the game away. So they finished in 1930 during the electric era of sound recording. Before 1928, it was acoustic recording. So most of the recordings we've got are acoustic recordings, that is recorded without any electrical amplification. The other interesting thing about these, they have a very quiet surface, and the quality, even the acoustically recorded ones, are very, very good. And you might ask, how do we play them, since we have to have a special pickup to play them, because a normal pickup doesn't respond to the vertical modulation. So what we do is we get a stereo cartridge, which has 4 outputs at the back, and we reverse one of the outputs. And that means the vertical modulation then translates into a normal sound. So we can play them.
Thank you for explaining that. I was fascinated looking at that. Thank you. Appreciate that. Earlier, when you were talking to me about your education, you mentioned that you had a great love of English amongst other subjects. And I know that you've loved writing and you've done a lot of writings. So what do you write about?
Well, after I retired, I started writing a few mainly technical, they were all technical articles for some of Australia's glossy magazines. There was Australian Hi-Fi, Electronics Australia, Amateur Radio Action was another one, and I actually got paid. So I wasn't looking for money, just the interest in writing and the thrill of being published. Yeah, it's so when I came to the Jazz Museum, another thing I did was produce a newsletter for the ABC Reunion Club. I used the computer program Publisher, which is a desktop publishing program, so I was able to produce quite an attractive-looking newsletter. So when I came here and I looked at the newsletter that was put out by the Australian Jazz Museum, or the Victorian Jazz Archive as it was then, I thought, I think they can do better. It was an adequate newsletter, but it was just a newsletter, and I thought maybe they should have a magazine rather than a newsletter. So I made the appropriate suggestion, and as a result, there was a committee set up, and they adopted my suggestion of using Publisher, the Microsoft program, as the desktop publishing program, and they started turning the newsletter into a magazine. And at one time, we were actually producing over 300 glossy magazines. It was 300 copies of a glossy magazine 4 times a year. But unfortunately, these days, the magazine goes out to members in electronic form, and we produce about 50 glossy magazines, which are very much nicer to hold and read than the electronic form.
Can the members still opt to get a hard copy? Or not?
They could. Yeah. If I suggest that it's going to cost management and the museum a bit more money, but I'm sure they can.
Yeah. What else have you been writing about?
Well, I then began writing articles for the magazine. I think I've written an article for pretty much every magazine since then on every subject you can imagine, interviews, history of jazz, history of this and that, technical information about the museum, items in the museum, donations, etc., etc. But I also write for a community newspaper, the Studfield-Wantirna Community News, which is a bi-monthly newspaper, and we have a half-page article purely about the Jazz Museum, which I've been writing for the last 15 years.
That's a lot. A half a page in a magazine, isn't it?
It's hard to think of something new to write about.
That's a lot of words. How many words go into a half page?
I don't count them. I just say that'll fit.
That'll fit. You talked about writing about objects as well. What's the weirdest object you've ever written an article about? The strangest, most unusual?
Well, an interesting article was about, I came across an entry in one of the early newsletters published by the museum that we had been bequeathed some old jazz records dating back to 1912. And I thought, jazz wasn't invented in 1912. The word only appeared in 1915. 1917, sorry, correction, 1917. And in fact, just as by and by, this particular recording here is by the original Dixieland Jazz Band. I'm not sure if I can go into a close-up. This is an English pressing, but from the original matrix, because inscribed in the shellac is the date, 1918, the date of this recording. Now, this is made the year after the very first jazz recording, which was 1917 by the same group. And it was the first time that the word jazz, was used in the context of jazz recording. Or jazz music, I should say.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remember this symbol near the dog with the gramophone.
As a matter of interest, super here. Beautiful sort of we're going to back in the picture. You'll see the Victor recording. That's the American label of pretty much the same. It's the same group, and that is the very first jazz recording ever produced. And you'll notice on that it says the word, or it spells the word jazz, J-A-S-S.
Yeah.
So there was a variation in the spelling of jazz in that very first recording. And we have that disc, that very disc, in our museum, an original pressing.
How did you acquire that?
I didn't acquire it. The museum acquired it. I'm not sure how they got it, but it's in our vaults.
Amazing.
Yeah. Now I was leading. That was a sidetrack there. Where was I heading? You asked me about the interesting thing.
Things.
Yeah, and I mentioned 1912. Now we've said 1917 for first jazz recording. The first. Now it was. This particular disc here is Skeleton Rag. It's a ragtime disc. Dates from 1912. In other words,
Thank you.
It precedes jazz. It was a syncopated, ragtime was a syncopated type of music, the predecessor of jazz.
It's beautiful. It really is beautiful, isn't it?
So we've got, I think, about a dozen of these 1912 recordings in virtually mint condition.
I wonder who donated these.
A little old lady, I believe, in her 80s or 90s or so on. Quite some years ago, before I actually arrived. It's just that I came across the fact that we had them in our vaults.
Beautiful. Really, they really are.
So that was one of the interesting items I wrote about, because it was a discovery. I don't think anybody else seemed to realise that they were in the museum.
I was thinking, I think when I first spoke to you, you did mention that you were thinking of retiring from here.
Because I've got so many things to do at home. Still building electronic projects, and for instance, I modified our burglar alarm because there was a house break-in our street. And although we've had a burglar alarm, it wasn't going to the people that break down the door when you're home. The burglar alarm's not going to do too much. And we did have what we call a panic button. Press the button and the burglar alarm goes off. But if we're in the bedroom and somebody breaks in the door, you're not going to be able to get to the panic button. So I rigged up a little circuit where I used a radio transmitter key, like a radio-operated car key. I could press the button, operate the panic button in the burglar alarm, and make a lot of noise and frighten the burglar's alarm and have away. So that was a little electronic project I dreamed up just recently. So, no, I keep busy, and I'm always hoping my wife will break something because I enjoy fixing it.
Does she break things on purpose so that you can fix?
I'm not sure. She does break things.
Well, it sounds like a match made in heaven. Will you retire from here?
Sorry,
Will you retire from here?
I'm trying to retire. I'm coming in less and less now.
Okay.
And I'm doing a lot of work. Any work I do is mainly from home. And there's a convenience because I can actually, any preservation work that I do at home, I can actually upload to the museum. So I can transmit, if you like, audio files from home to the museum's server. And I can access information on the computers from home. So there's quite often not a lot of reason to come into the building, except to get perhaps some acetate discs or whatever that might need restoring.
When you were at your aunt's place, when you were a little boy, 8 years old, could you imagine that your life would have, so much of your life would have been spent doing what you've been doing?
Well, no, because I'd done so many things when I think about it. Perhaps I could mention the restoration work that I do. I'm not sure if I mentioned before that my collection of 3,000 or so 78s, over the years I've been slowly digitising those and recording them onto CDs. And in the digitisation process, I've been cleaning up the music. That's something that we normally don't do in the Jazz Museum. I mentioned before a lot of our recordings come in on acetates, and when you play back these acetates, they tend to be very scratchy, noisy, clicks, pops, whatever. It's very scratchy in particular. So that noise has to be removed. And it's fortuitous that I had this skill of being able to restore these, remove the noise without affecting the music. And that's a bit of a skill that takes a lot of time to develop. And having worked on 3,078s, that's been a lot of experience.
So you practice.
So when I arrived here, I'd been working on that for a while. So I was rather skilled at being able to do that. People tend to remove too much noise and that removes music with it, and the sound is never the same. You lose reverberance or reverberation of the sound when you do that, so you've got to be very careful. So the computer program is the real master, but it's the operator that's important as well. And I'm just lucky that I've been able to do that. And as a matter of fact, when I came here, we'd reached, incidentally, we perhaps should talk about this. The museum, originally the Jazz Archive, has produced CDs for its members from the beginning. Members are usually issued with a CD when they join, and they were given a CD when they rejoin or replenish their membership. Not only that, but we produce CDs for sale to members, and well, originally it was for members, but now it's for the public. And over the years, in fact, since I've been here, I've produced over 40 CDs of vintage jazz. And most, if not all of that jazz has had to be cleaned up, restored, made more pristine than it was originally. So, if you like, one of my main achievements, I feel, here has been able to restore this music in a professional manner and make available to the public.
Next time I listen to my copies of those CDs, I will be much more mindful of the work that's gone into producing that very high quality sound, which I didn't know about before,
In fact, having worked in the ABC taught me about professionalism. That's one of the reasons why I picked on the newsletter. That when I came here, I thought it's not professional enough. Likewise, and I don't want to denigrate the people who made the first CDs for the museum, but some of the early CDs, the restorations could have been improved. They were adequate, but they could have been improved. But they were done by people who didn't have quite the full skills, hadn't been, you would say, professionally taught or hadn't had the experience. Anyway, they were adequate, but they could have been improved, and I did. I improved about half a dozen of the early masters, remastered them. So that was another achievement.
It's a big achievement, isn't it? When you look back, when you look back on your life, I remember years ago when I was training, someone saying to me that when people look back and they're asked to sort of look back on the key points in their life, they very often pick negative things that happened in their life, bad instances that have happened, hardships. When you look back on your life, what sort of achievements do you think of that, stand out, that kind of mark the pillars along the way in your life?
Well, after joining the ABC, I always wanted to work in a radio station, and I achieved that. As I mentioned, I worked design of technical equipment. I was a technocrat, so that was enjoyable. Moving into training was something I didn't expect to do. I was effectively a school teacher, you might say. So that was unexpected, but rewarding. In fact, I meet a lot of people at ABC reunion club functions that come up and say, you got me my first job. And these are people that have since retired. So that's very rewarding.
Yeah.
And my achievements here at the Jazz Museum was, first of all, being so being able to help move the newsletter into the form of a magazine, and to improve the quality of the CDs that we're producing. And we achieved some interesting CDs. For instance, here's one of our CDs. I'll hold it up again. It contains 40 tracks that were professionally recorded in Melbourne, mainly in Melbourne. I think some were in South Australia. 40 tracks that were professionally recorded by Bill Miller, who was a jazz personality. That's probably the wrong word. Enthusiast. He led discussions on jazz. He had a radio program on 3UZ in the 1930s, 1938. He commenced a jazz program on 3UZ, read by and he wrote the scripts. They were read by Rolly Barley, who was an announcer, and that ran into might have been 1939 to 40, but for a couple of years he wrote for a jazz program. And then he decided that there was not enough jazz, if any, being recorded by the international record companies in Australia. So he set up his own recording organisation, which he called Ampersand. We showed the Ampersand recording before. Anyway, we had this. We did when they were talking about depressing, and I did mention that it was Bill Armstrong. Bill Miller, who produced the Ampersand label. Anyway, he produced more masters, more recordings that were ever issued. Why? Because they had technical faults. There might have been hum on the recording, or thumps, other odd noises, or performance faults, blowing the wrong note on a trumpet or a saxophone. And I was, of course, in the 40s, there were no computers, so these faults couldn't be fixed after the recording had been made. But with computer programs, I was able to remove hum, noises, and in fact, even the wrong note on the trumpet or the saxophone, you cut and paste. You find the right note and put it in place of the wrong.
Vocalists, they sort of squeezed that up a bit.
That's right. There was one of these tracks, terrific track, but the pianist knocked up his solo, ruined the record because his solo was wrong. So I just seamlessly removed the piano solo, and we had a nice recording. So these were that was quite an achievement, to think that these 40 tracks of professionally recorded music by Australia's top musicians from the 1940s were able to be released in the 10 years ago or so.
That is fantastic, isn't it?
So we're very pleased with that. Now, we did the same thing with the Jazz Art catalogue. Bob Clements was another, he originally was a saxophone player and had a record shop in Melbourne, and he produced his own label for the same reason that Australian jazz musicians were not being recorded by the international company. So he set up Jazz Art, his Jazz Art recording. He produced around about 50 78, double-sided 78s, plus 3 LPs. And I was able to restore all that music. It was a bit easier because they were on 78s, but because a lot of these records were reduced just after the war, when the material shortages meant that the shellac and the vinyl that was used for the pressings was rather poor quality. So some of them were quite noisy. So some of them had some high levels of noise to remove. But anyway, they were restored, and that was another great achievement. The whole catalogue of Jazz Art was released on 5 CDs by the jazz archive at that time.
Those achievements will be carried forward, listened to for many, many years to come, because they're in a sustainable format now, and lots of people here and people who might watch this interview will have a much better idea of how all these things happen. Well, I've certainly come away with a much better idea. I'd like to sort of finish up pretty soon. Is there anything else that you would like to say? I know I did interrupt you then, and sorry about that, but what were you, so anything else that you'd like to say, or that you'll go?
I'm actually doing that our digitisation was based on items which deteriorated in time, like reel-to-reel tapes, cassettes, and acetate recordings. But nowadays, we're turning into and now what was the word? And the phrase escapes me. The Jazz Museum, which is providing the audio streaming on demand in the form of downloads and streaming. Virtual museum, that's the word I want. The Jazz Museum's turning into a virtual museum. So now we're in the process of digitising, if possible, everything, and providing that material to the public in terms of downloads or streaming.
Yeah, Mel Blatchford talked about that, partly to do with the deterioration, but partly to do with the way the world is going and moving in that direction, and the accessibility for people all over the world to be able to have access to all this information that you've got here, which wouldn't be possible if it was just solely on hard copies of things.
But it's a huge job, and a lot of it will be carried on by our videographer, Steve. He will carry on from where I leave off as I retire.
Since everyone noticed this,
No, and do it gladly.
as Steve said, he's glad to be looking forward to that job. Well,
no, it's been a very rewarding 17 years, and as I say, I feel proud of these achievements, and not just rewarding, but just interesting. And there was the social aspect, meeting so many interesting people, not just the musicians that we mentioned, but there's been so many. I was here at a time when many of the originators of the museum were still alive. Most of them, unfortunately and sadly, have passed on now. In fact, Margaret Anderson should be mentioned because she's one of the initiators of the museum who's still actively working at the museum. So it's been nice to have met people like Margaret and her husband, who's passed on some years ago, and Ray Marginson, who was responsible for the museum site here at Wantona, and Noel Blatchford, he was here before me. He's been here. The second, apart from Margaret, the second longest person presently serving at the museum. So it's been nice meeting all of these staff. And I think you mentioned that a lot of these people are highly skilled and educated, and that's been interesting too, to meet people with these skills, tasks, knowledge, etc.
well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been lovely to meet with you.
Well, you've stressed my brain a bit, but I think we've got that.
It's a good thing.